barren. The word fell across the long dining hall of Ravensmoor like a dropped goblet, and 300 candles did not so much as flinch. Lord Garrick Ravensmoor, 11th Earl of Wildercombe, said it again so the lords seated below the salt would be certain they had heard it. My wife is barren, and a marriage that bears no heir is no marriage at all. I will have it dissolved. He did not look at her when he said it. That was the cruelty in it, that a man could end a woman before 100 witnesses and keep his eyes on his wine. Lady Marianne Ravensmoor sat at the foot of his table in a gown the colour of dried blood, her hands folded, her spine a straight line that had cost her every ounce of strength she owned to hold. She did not weep. She did not rise. She did not beg. She looked once at the woman seated, scandalously, at the Earl's right hand, Sabine Carew in emerald silk, a new diamond at her throat, her painted mouth pressed into the small triumphant line of a cat that has been promised the cream, and then Marianne looked away again, and there was something in the quiet of her that should have frightened every man in that hall. No one saw it. They were too busy watching the Earl. If you have ever been counted as nothing in a room full of people who owed you everything, stay with me, because this is the story of the night the accounting was settled, and if it earns your respect before the end, subscribe, so the next one finds you. Marianne Ravensmoor had been mistress of Ravensmoor for 9 years, and in 9 years she had learnt the estate the way a physician learns a body. She knew which of the 400 tenants were behind on their rents and why, and which of those owed it to a bad harvest and which to a gambling son, and she had quietly forgiven the first and quietly paid the second out of her own settlement, so that no child on Ravensmoor land went to bed cold while she could prevent it. She knew the names of every servant and the names of their mothers. The kitchen maids called her my lady to her face, and the good one behind her back, which is a far rarer and more dangerous title than people understand. The Earl knew none of this. The Earl knew the cut of his coats and the line of his hunters, and the exact degree to which Sabine Carew's laugh rose when he said something she found clever. And he had decided, somewhere in the 3rd year of their marriage, that his wife was a cold and disappointing thing because she did not flatter him and would not pretend that his debts were victories. What he never troubled to learn was the one fact that would unmake him. He thought Marianne was poor. He thought he had married a quiet, plain-spoken girl with a respectable name and a modest portion, and that her quietness was emptiness, and her economy was the meanness of a woman who had nothing. He was wrong on every count, and he had built 9 years of contempt on the strength of being wrong. And that is the thing about a proud and incurious man. He will lay the whole foundation of his ruin himself and call it good sense. And yet, even on that night, in the private dark behind his loud face, the Earl was not so certain as he performed. He had married Marianne Ashcombe because his mother had ordered it, and his creditors had agreed with her. And somewhere underneath the contempt he had taught himself there sat a small, cold splinter of unease he never named, the memory of his own wedding day. When old Hector Ashcombe's lawyer had smiled at him across the settlement table the way a man smiles who knows a thing you do not, and had said, signing, "You'll find the Ashcombe blood pays its debts, my lord, in its own season and its own coin." Garrick had laughed at it then. He had taken the dowry, which was modest, and married the girl, who was quiet, and never once wondered why a nabob worth a kingdom had given his only granddaughter to a half-ruined earl for so plain a portion. A wiser man would have wondered. A wiser man would have been afraid. Garrick Ravensmoor had simply been relieved, and had spent 9 years mistaking his relief for cleverness. Let me take you back a little. because the wound the Earl dealt at that table was not the first cut, only the deepest, and a thing this cruel must be earned by the cruelty before it. There had been smaller cruelties first, a long ladder of them, each one witnessed, each one filed away in the silence of the woman who took them. There was the night, 2 summers gone, when the Earl had made his wife stand at the door of her own ballroom and receive 100 guests, while Sabine Caro sat in the place of honour at the high table, and Marianne had curtsied to women who had once curtsied to her, and watched them pretend not to see her. There was the morning he had her allowance halved in front of the steward, since she spends it on tenants and not on herself, and so plainly does not want it. There was the public dinner where he had asked her, smiling before the soup, how it felt to be the only countess in England who had given her lord nothing to show for 9 years, and the table had laughed, uncertain, and Marianne had answered, evenly, "Patience, my lord, is the one gift that improves with keeping." And the Earl had not understood why the line unsettled him, and had drunk 3 glasses to forget it. Each of these the household saw. Each of these Bess saw, standing behind her mistress's chair with her face like a shut-box and her heart like a banked fire. And each of these Marianne set down, without protest, in the long account she was keeping in the only ledger that mattered, which was her memory, against the day the column would be totalled. Marianne had come to Ravensmoor at 18, married to Garrick by an arrangement her grandfather had made, and her grandfather had not lived to explain. Old Hector Ashcombe had been a strange, sharp, secretive man, a younger son who had gone east with the company and come home 30 years later with a fortune no one could quite measure, and a habit of trusting no one, least of all the great families who had sneered at him as a boy. He had bought land. He had bought it quietly, through agents, under other men's names. And the largest and quietest of all his purchases, Marianne would not learn this for 9 years, had been the freehold of Ravensmoor itself, the ground the Earls of Wildeckham had stood upon for 200 years, and had, in the spendthrift generation before Garrick, secretly and shamefully sold to clear a debt. The Earls did not own Ravensmoor. They had not owned it since before Garrick was born. They held it on a long lease from a holding company whose true proprietor had been Hector Ashcombe, and was now, by a settlement old Hector had drawn with a lawyer's malice and a grandfather's love, to be opened only on a day of her choosing, his granddaughter Marianne. She did not know it on the night the Earl called her baron. She knew only that she had a packet of her grandfather's papers, sealed, that her grandmother had pressed into her hands at the wedding with the words, "Open these the day they make you choose between your pride and your peace child, and not one day before." She had carried them through 9 years and never broken the seal, because she had not yet been made to choose. That night she chose. But I am ahead of myself, and the wound is not finished. Hold the word baron in your mind, because it was a lie, and it was the particular kind of lie that requires the liar to have done a monstrous thing to make it true. In the 2nd year of the marriage, Marianne had borne the Earl twins. 2 sons. She had carried them through a hard winter and delivered them in a locked room with only the midwife and her own maid Bess, and she had held them, 2 small dark-haired boys with the Ravensmoor brow, for the space of a single night, and in the morning they were gone. The Earl had been told the children were stillborn. He had been told it by his own mother, the old countess, a woman of iron and ice who had decided that Marianne Ashcombe's blood was not fit to inherit Wildercombe, that a granddaughter of a company nabob was a stain to be bred out and not bred from, and who had, with the help of a paid physician and a terrified midwife, taken the living children from their mother's arms and put it about that they had died. Marianne had been told her sons were dead. She had grieved them as dead for 7 years, and here is the cruelty within the cruelty: the old countess had not killed them. She could not quite bring herself to that, or perhaps she thought a living card might one day be worth playing. She had sent the twins away to a tenant farm on the far edge of the estate to be raised as the sons of a shepherd named Croft, ignorant of their name. 2 strong, dark boys growing up among sheep within sight of the house that should have been theirs. The old countess had died 3 years past with the secret unconfessed, believing it buried. It was not buried. Because Bess, Marianne's maid, sharp-tongued, loyal with a memory like a steel trap and a hatred of injustice that ran deeper than her fear, had followed the cart that took the babies away. Bess had known for 7 years exactly where the Earl's disowned sons were growing up. And she had said nothing, because to speak was to die, and because she was waiting, as her mistress was waiting, for the day the Ashcombe women would be made to choose. Now you understand the table. Now you understand why Marianne Ravensmore did not weep when her husband called her Baron before 100 lords, because the word was not an insult, it was a confession. And the only people in that hall who knew it were the woman accused, the maid behind her chair, and a quiet, unfashionable man seated far down among the lesser gentry who had spent 3 years falling in love with the Countess of Wildicombe and had never once let it show. His name was Sir Tobias Vane. He was the magistrate of the district, a widower of 40, plain in his dress and plainer in his speech, a man who had no great fortune and no great name and a reputation among people who valued such things for being impossible to bribe and tedious to dine with, because he would insist on telling the truth. Tobias Vane had met Marianne 3 years before, not at a ball, but at a gaol, at the cell the night before a hanging, where a half-starved poacher was condemned to die for taking 3 rabbits off Ravensmore land to feed his family, and where the Countess of Wildicombe had come, alone, on foot, in the rain, to plead for his life with the magistrate, because the boy was the son of one of her tenants, and she could not let a child go fatherless over 3 rabbits while she had breath. Vane had refused her, because the law was the law. And then he had watched her sit down on the whetstone bench outside his court, this great lady in her ruined slippers, and quietly, without weeping, begin to write. A petition, a confession of the family's hunger, an offer to pay the value of the rabbits 100-fold out of her own purse, anything, every legal door she could find. And he had understood, in that hour, that he had never in his life met a person of such relentless, unshowy mercy, and that he would do a great deal to deserve her good opinion. He had found a way to save the poacher. He had not told her it was she who saved him. And he had loved her, hopelessly and silently, from that night, knowing she was the wife of a fool who did not see her, and being too honourable to wish the fool dead. He did not know the name of the poacher he saved was Croft, and he did not know that the shepherd Croft on the far edge of Ravensmore was raising 2 boys who were not his. He would learn it. Everyone in that hall would learn it. But on the night the Earl said Baron, Tobias Vane only set down his wine very carefully, so that no one should see his hand shake, and looked at the foot of the table where the woman he loved sat being murdered with a word, and waited, because he trusted her, and because a man who truly loves a strong woman learns when to be still and let her rise. The Earl, having ended his marriage between the soup and the fish, was in an expansive mood. He rose, and the hall rose with him, and he lifted his glass towards Sabine Carow in her emerald silk, and he announced that in 6 weeks, at the great harvest gala of Ravensmore, the autumn ball that drew every family of consequence in 3 counties. He would celebrate his betrothal to Miss Carow, and that by spring the dissolution of his barren marriage would be complete, and Ravensmore would have at last a mistress fit to bear it an heir. The lords cheered. They cheered because he was an earl and the wine was good, and Sabine Carow was beautiful in the loud, bright way that men cheer for, and because not one of them thought of the silent woman at the foot of the table as anything but a sad embarrassment to be got past. Sabine smiled and dipped her head and let the diamond catch the light, and under the table her hand found the Earl's and pressed it, and she thought, with the clean, simple greed that was the whole of her, that she had won. She had played a long game for this. She had come to Ravensmore 4 years before as the penniless widow of a wine merchant, with nothing but her face and her wits and an absolute determination to be a countess, and she had studied the Earl's vanity the way a locksmith studies a lock, and she had flattered and yielded and wept on cue and dropped the small poisoned words about the cold barren wife at exactly the right moments over. Exactly the right number of months, and now the lock had sprung. What Sabine did not know, what Sabine, being a woman whose power came entirely from the Earl's belief in her, could not afford to know, was that she had built her own long game on the same false foundation he had. She thought she was marrying the owner of Ravensmore. She was marrying a tenant who did not own the bed he slept in. And the woman who did own it was sitting 12 feet away in a blood-red gown, watching her with the seal on her grandfather's packet finally, after 9 years, broken. Marianne rose from the table. She did it so quietly that for a moment no one marked it. She did not make a scene. Making a scene was Sabine's craft, not hers. She simply stood and inclined her head to her husband with a courtesy so perfect it was its own rebuke, and said, in a voice pitched to carry no farther than the head of the table, "As you wish, my lord. I will trouble you to let me remain at Ravensmore until the harvest gala. After that night, I think you will find I trouble you very little." And she walked the length of the hall and out of the great doors with her maid behind her, and the lords watched her go and thought, "Poor creature, she takes it hard," and went back to their wine. They did not hear what Bess heard, on the stair when they were alone, that their mistress, who had not wept at the table, did not weep on the stair either, but stopped at the turn of it, and laid her hand flat against the cold stone wall of the house that was hers, and said very low, "6 weeks. Bess, find me my sons." Now the work began, and I want you to watch how she did it, because she did not do it the way a wronged woman in a story does it, with passion and accusation and a knife. She did it the way a woman who has run an estate for 9 years does it, with patience, with documents, with witnesses, and with an absolute refusal to strike one moment before the blow would land where it could not be parried. The first thing she did was nothing. For a full week she kept to her rooms, the picture of a humiliated wife in her last weeks of grace, and she let the household believe she was broken. Because a broken woman is not watched. Bess went out among the tenants on errands that fooled no one and meant nothing, and met, in the lee of a dry stone wall on the far moor, a shepherd named Croft, an honest, frightened man who had been waiting 7 years for someone to come, who would raise 2 boys he loved and dreaded the day he must give them up, and who confessed, weeping, that the old countess had brought him 2 newborn sons of gentle blood in the dead of a winter night and a purse of gold to ask no questions, and that he had asked none, but he had kept. He had kept the swaddling bands the babies came in, fine linen worked with a small embroidered crest, the crest of Ravensmore quartered with a stranger's arms, the arms of Ashcombe. and he had kept the physician's note that came with them in the old countess's own hand that said, "God forgive me, keep them living, and never tell." Marianne held that note in her 2 hands for a long time when Bess brought it to her. She had grieved her sons as dead for 7 years. She read in her dead enemy's handwriting that they were alive, and that the woman who had stolen them had not been able, in the end, to make herself a murderess. And she sat with that, alone, the one human hour of weakness she allowed herself in the whole 6 weeks. And she let the tears come for the 7 stolen years, and then she dried them and never wept again. Because grief is a thing the strong feel privately and set down before the work. And the work was not yet done. She did not go to the boys. That was the hardest restraint of all, and she made it on purpose, because 2 strong, dark 11-year-old boys appearing at the great house would have warned the Earl, and a warned Earl might have done what his mother could not, and Marianne would not gamble her sons' lives on 6 weeks of patience. So she let them be, watched and guarded by Bess and the shepherd, and she turned to the papers. But the world does not hold still while the patient work, and in the 3rd week of those 6, the whole quiet plan came within a breath of ending before it began. For Sabine Carew, who was no fool and who had risen by noticing what other women missed, had begun to notice things. She noticed that the maid Bess, who had no cause to leave the house, was abroad on the far moor twice a week in weather no errand justified. She noticed that the cast-off countess, who ought by every law of nature to be weeping in her rooms or scheming for a settlement, was instead serene. And a serene enemy frightened Sabine more than a weeping one. So Sabine did what her kind always do. She set a watch. She sent the Earl's huntsman, a brutal and curious man who owed her money, to follow the maid, and one grey afternoon the huntsman tracked Bess across 2 miles of bracken to the lee of the dry stone wall, and he saw her meet the shepherd Croft, and he saw at the door of Croft's low cottage 2 dark-haired boys. And he was not a clever man, but even a dull man counts to 2, and he knew the household had buried 2 stillborn sons 11 years gone, and he turned his horse and rode hard for the house to sell what he had seen to the woman who had paid for it. Marianne learned of it within the hour, because the strong do not work alone. And because the kitchen of a great house is a kind of nervous system that the master never feels and the good mistress feels in her sleep. A scullery girl, whose mother Marianne had nursed through a fever, ran 1/2 mile in the rain to warn her that the huntsman had come in white and breathless and asked to see Miss Carew alone. And here you saw what 9 years of running an estate had built in Marianne Ravensmore, because she did not panic, and she did not move too soon. She simply did the one thing that would unmake the threat at its root. She reached the huntsman before he reached Sabine. She did not bribe him. A bribed man stays bought only until the next bidder. She sent Bess to him with a single sheet of paper, a copy, made that very hour by Mr. Penhallow's clerk, of a bond the huntsman had signed 3 years before, a debt to a Ravensmore tenant the man had thought long forgotten, a debt Marianne had quietly bought up that afternoon and now held, and with it one line in her own hand: "I own your note, as I will shortly own a great deal more. Carry your tale to Miss Carew, and you will hang for the deer you took last Michaelmas, for I have the keeper's sworn word of it. Carry it nowhere, and your debt is burned in front of you tonight." The huntsman was a brute, but a brute can read a gallows, and he chose the rope he could see over the coin he could not, and he went to Sabine and told her, sweating, that he had followed the maid 2 miles to a shepherd's croft, and found nothing there but sheep and a half-wit's brats, and that the countess walked the moor for her health like the cracked thing she was. Sabine believed him, because she wanted to, because she had a gala to plan and a countess to become, and no patience left for a maid's wanderings. The watch was called off. The boys were never named. And Marianne, who had come within one frightened scullery girl and one bought bond of total ruin, did not afterward congratulate herself. She only moved the boys that night to a safer house, a widow's cottage nearer the gatehouse, and she understood, with a clarity that did not leave her again, that the only thing standing between her sons and the grave was her own refusal to be hurried. She turned back to the papers. The grandfather's packet was a maze, and it took her the better part of 3 weeks and 2 secret meetings with a London attorney, a careful dry man named Mr. Penhallow, brought down at night through the servants' gate and gone again before dawn, to walk through all of it. But at the centre of the maze was a single clean truth. Hector Ashcombe had owned the ground Ravensmoor stood on. The Earls held it on a 99-year lease, and the lease contained a clause drafted by old Hector's malice and never read by the spendthrift Earl who signed it because he had been drunk and desperate and had only wanted the money, that the freeholder might void the lease and resume possession of the entire estate upon the failure of the lessee's lawful male issue, and that the freehold and all rights in it passed, on Hector's death, to his granddaughter Marianne, and to her lawful sons after her. Read that clause again the way Mr. Penhallow read it to her by candlelight, and feel it close like a trap. The Earl had stood up at his own table and announced to 100 witnesses that he had no lawful issue. He had declared his wife barren. He had, with his own proud mouth, before a hall full of lords who could be called to testify, triggered the very clause that voided his lease and resumed the estate to her. And in the same breath he had been wrong, because he was not without lawful issue. He had 2 living sons, born in lawful wedlock, hidden by his own mother on his own land. And those sons were not only the heirs that would have saved his lease, they were, after their mother, the next freeholders of Ravensmoor. The Earl had cast out the one woman who held the deed to his name, and disowned the 2 boys who were his only claim to the ground under his feet, and he had done all of it in public, on the record, of his own free will, out of vanity. Mr. Penhallow, who had been a lawyer for 40 years and had thought himself past surprise, took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes and said, "My lady, I have never in my professional life seen a man destroy himself so thoroughly without assistance. We need only let him keep talking." But Marianne did not want to let him keep talking. She wanted one night, before the maximum number of witnesses, when the whole proud world that had watched her humiliation could watch its reversal, and the Earl himself had given her the night. The Harvest Gala. So she made her preparations with the cold thoroughness of a general. She had Mr. Penhallow prepare the documents, the freehold deed, the lease with its fatal clause, the settlement naming her, and a separate sealed instrument she would not let even Bess see, and she arranged for him to be present at the gala, in a plain coat, as the unremarkable guest of a county family who owed her a favour. She had Bess bring the shepherd Croft and the 2 boys to the gatehouse on the night of the ball, dressed and waiting, with the embroidered swaddling bands and the old countess's note. She wrote to 3 of the lords who had been at the dinner, careful, grateful, unremarkable letters that asked only that they do her the kindness of attending the gala, where she hoped to clear up, before witnesses, certain questions of property that touched their own estates. Each of those 3 men held land that bordered Ravensmoor and traced through old Ashcombe holdings, and each of them, reading her letter, felt a small, cold finger of worry and resolved to come. And on the last night before the gala, when every paper was sealed and every witness placed, and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning, Marianne Ravensmore sat alone in the dark of her room with the swaddling bands across her knees, and for 1 hour she was not a strategist or a freeholder or a countess, but only a mother who had been told her babies were dead and had believed it for 7 years, and the steel went out of her, and she was afraid. Not of the Earl. She had stopped fearing the Earl somewhere in the 3rd week. But of the morning after, of 2 boys who had a shepherd for a father and sheep for a kingdom, and did not know her face, who would be told in 1 violent hour that their whole small world was a lie, and that the cold grand woman in the sapphires was their mother. She was afraid they would not want her. She was afraid that in winning them their birthright, she would lose the only thing she had ever wanted, which was simply to be, to one living soul, not a duty or a fortune, but a person who was loved. She sat with that fear and did not run from it, because she had learned that the strong are not the ones who feel nothing, but the ones who feel everything and act rightly anyway. And toward dawn she folded the bands and rose and washed her face, and was, when Bess came in with the candle, the Countess again, but harder underneath, and gentler, both at once. The way only a person is who has looked squarely at what their victory might cost them and chosen to pay it. And she said nothing to Tobias Vane. That was deliberate too, and it cost her, because in the long nights of that terrible month the one warmth she had was the knowledge that somewhere down the table there had been a man who set down his wine so his hand would not betray him. A man who had once saved a poacher and never claimed the credit. A man who looked at her as though she were a person and not a disappointment. She knew what he was. She had known for 3 years. But she would not draw him into her ruin until she knew whether it would be ruin or rising, because she had been married once to a man who used her, and she would not begin again by using even a good man. Even for love. If she rose, she would come to Tobias Vane clean, with her name restored and her sons at her side, and nothing owed. If she fell, she would not drag him down. So she let him believe, with everyone else, that the Countess of Wildacombe was a broken, cast-off wife. And Tobias Vane, who knew her, did not believe it for 1 moment, and waited, and quietly, on his own account, began to ask certain questions about the Shepherd Croft, because a good magistrate notices when a poor man on a great estate suddenly has more to fear than poaching. The 6 weeks ran out. The Harvest Gala of Ravensmore was the event of the autumn, and the Earl spared nothing, because he was a man who hid his bankruptcy under display, and because he wanted all 3 counties to see Sabine Carew on his arm in the place his barren wife had failed to fill. The great house blazed, every window threw gold across the lawns, the long gallery was hung with the harvest's bounty, sheaves and apples and amberlight, an orchestra played from the minstrel's gallery. And 400 guests in silken jewels moved through rooms that did not, though only 1 woman alive yet knew it, belong to the man whose name was on the invitations. Sabine Carew descended the great stair at 9 o'clock in a gown of cloth of gold, and the hall applauded, and she drank it in like wine, because this was the summit she had climbed 4 years to reach. The Earl stood at the foot of the stair to receive her, splendid and proud, and behind his pride, if you knew where to look, the small tightness of a man who has borrowed against this night and needs it to be perfect. He had not seen his wife in a week. He had been told she kept her rooms. He assumed she would not come, and if she came, that she would have the decency to be invisible. At 10:30, when the rooms were as full as they would be, when every guest of consequence in 3 counties was packed into the great gallery and the lesser hall and the supper room, when the orchestra had paused between sets and the Earl had climbed 3 steps of the great stair to make his betrothal toast with Sabine glittering at his side, the doors at the far end of the gallery opened, and the Countess of Wildacombe came in. She did not come in broken. She had let them believe broken for 6 weeks, and now she let the belief shatter on the sight of her. And that contrast was a weapon she had forged on purpose. She wore not the blood red of her humiliation, but deep midnight blue, severe and magnificent, with the Ashcombe sapphires at her throat. Sapphires no one at Ravensmoor had ever seen, because she had never once felt the need to wear her grandfather's fortune until the night she meant to spend it. Her dark hair was dressed plain and high. She wore no expression of grief or anger, and that absence was the most frightening thing about her, because a wronged woman who comes in weeping can be pitied and managed and shown the door. But a wronged woman who comes in calm has clearly come for a reason, and 400 people felt the difference in their skins before a single one of them could have named it. She walked up the centre of the gallery, unhurried, the way she had walked the length of the dining hall 6 weeks before, except that then she had been walking out of a life, and now she was walking into one, and the crowd parted before her the way crowds part before something they cannot read. Faces she had curtsied to, faces that had laughed at the Earl's cruel little dinner jokes, faces that had cut her in the village street these past weeks because the wind had changed. All of them turned, and on every one of them she watched the same swift weather pass. First, the easy contempt of people who have decided a story is over. Then a flicker of confusion at the sapphires and the bearing. Then the first cold seed of doubt. She had counted on that doubt. She had dressed for it. And a silence ran ahead of her up the room until it reached the great stair, where the Earl stood with his glass half lifted and the word of his toast dying on his mouth, and Sabine Caro's gold-clad triumph curdling slowly into something colder. "Forgive me, my lord," Marianne said, and her voice was not loud, but the silence carried it to every corner of that hall. "You did me the honour 6 weeks ago of ending our marriage before 100 witnesses. I thought it only courteous to answer you before 400. The Earl recovered himself, he was proud, and pride is a kind of courage. 'Madam,' he said, 'you are not wanted here. This is a celebration. I will have you removed.' 'You will not,' said Marian, 'because the men who would remove me serve me, not you, and have done so for 9 years, though you never noticed. But pray, do not take my word for it.' Mr. Penhallow and the dry, quiet London attorney stepped out of the crowd in his plain coat, with a green taped bundle under his arm, and the 3 border lords she had written to drew unconsciously closer, and Tobias Vane, far back in the press, felt his heart turn over, because he saw it now. He saw that she had never been broken, that the still woman at the foot of the table had been a sword in its sheath the whole time, and he did the only thing a man who loves a woman rising can do. He stayed silent, and made himself ready to catch her if she fell, and was fiercely, painfully glad. "My Lord Earl," said Mr. Penhallow, in the flat carrying voice of a man reading a writ, "I am instructed by the freeholder of this estate to give you formal notice. The ground on which this house stands, and the whole demesne of Ravensmoor, has been held by the Earls of Wildercombe these 40 years, not in freehold, but on a lease of 99 years, granted by the holding company of the late Mr. Hector Ashcombe. The freehold was never yours. It was sold by your father, in the year before your birth, to clear a debt, a sale your family has concealed for 2 generations. A sound went through the gallery, a long, low intake of breath from 400 throats, and the Earl's face went the colour of tallow. "That is a lie," he said, but his voice had lost its flaw. "It is the public record at the rolls, my lord, and I have the registered deed here, and a certified copy lodged in London against the chance of accident. Penhallow, let that sit. Then, the lease contains a clause. Upon the failure of the lessee's lawful male issue, the freeholder may void the lease and resume the estate. 6 weeks ago, my lord, at your own table, before these same lords now present, you declared yourself a man without lawful issue. You declared your wife barren and your marriage void for want of an heir. You triggered the clause with your own mouth before witnesses, and the freeholder who stands before you has elected to act upon it. The Earl looked at Marianne, and for the first time in 9 years he truly looked at her, and the look was horror dawning into understanding. You, he said, your grandfather's money. You knew. All these years I knew nothing, said Marianne, until the night you taught me I had nothing left to lose. My grandfather left me a sealed packet and a single instruction to open it the day I was made to choose between my pride and my peace. You made me choose, my lord, at the foot of your table in front of 100 men. So I opened it. Everything Mr. Penhallow says is true, and it is the smaller of the 2 things I came to say. And in the space of that pause, the Earl of Wildicombe felt the floor of 9 years give way beneath him, and what rushed up into the gap was not fear of poverty, that came later, but something he had spent his whole life outrunning, which was the plain knowledge of his own smallness. He thought in one sick instant of 100 mornings he had walked past this woman without a word, of the night she had come in soaked from the rain and he had not asked her where she had been, of the time a tenant child had died and Marianne had wept and he had told her, irritated, that accounties did not grieve for cottagers, of every laugh he had let Sabine raise at her expense. He had told himself for 9 years that his wife was cold, and standing on his own stair, with the whole county watching, he understood that she had never been cold, that the coldness had been the still surface a deep thing keeps, and that he had married a woman of more worth than he would meet again in his life, and had spent that worth, like a fool spends gold, on nothing out of vanity, because she had not flattered him. That is the particular hell reserved for the proud and the blind, not that they are punished, but that the punishment arrives wearing the face of everything they refuse to see, so that they cannot even hate it cleanly. He opened his mouth, and for one moment the man he might have been looked out of his eyes, and he very nearly said the only word that could have bought him a scrap of grace, sorry. But his pride closed his throat as it had closed it for 9 years, and the moment passed, and after it there was only the ruin. And here Sabine Carew made the mistake that women like Sabine always make at the end, which is to fight for a thing that is already lost, because her whole self was built on it, and she did not know how to be anything if she was not winning. She came down 2 steps of the stair, bold and furious, and she said, "This is a trick." She is barren and bitter, and she has cooked up some lawyer's nonsense to spoil what she could not keep. The Earl has no heir, everyone knows it. She gave him no son in 9 years. I gave him 2, said Marianne. The words were very quiet, and they stopped the room more completely than any shout. I gave him 2 sons in the 2nd year of our marriage in a locked room with my maid and a midwife, and they were taken from my arms in the night, and I was told they were dead, and I grieved them as dead for 7 years. They were not dead. She turned from Sabine, whom she had finished with, to her husband, who had gone perfectly still. Your mother took them, my lord. The old countess could not bear that Ashcombe blood should inherit Wildicombe, so she stole your living sons, and put it about they were stillborn, and she could not quite bring herself to kill them, so she gave them to a shepherd on your own land to raise as his own, within sight of this house. And she died 3 years ago with the secret in her mouth. You did not know. I will grant you that you did not know your mother had robbed you of your heirs, but you knew you cast out a faithful wife to wed your mistress, and you called me baron to 100 lords to make it lawful. And in calling me baron, you did not only lie, you slandered 2 living boys to clear your own road. Bring them in." The doors at the far end opened again, and the shepherd Croft came in, hat in his hands, terrified and resolute, and behind him walked 2 boys. 2 strong, dark-haired boys, with the Ravensmoor brow, the brow that was on every portrait in the gallery they now walked beneath, and they stopped, frightened, in the centre of that blaze of light and silk. And 400 people looked from the boys' faces to the painted faces of dead earls on the walls, and saw the same face, and the great gallery filled with a sound that was not a cheer and was not a gasp, but was the sound of a whole assembly understanding at once that they were watching a true thing. Bess came forward with the fine swaddling bands worked with the joined crests, and with a yellowed note in the old countess's own hand, "God forgive me, keep them living and never tell," and she gave them to one of the 3 border lords, a hard old man who had known the late countess 30 years, and he read the note and looked at the boys and looked at the earl, and he said, in a voice like a closing door, "It is her hand. I would know it anywhere. Garrick, these are your sons." The Earl of Wildicombe sat down. There was no chair behind him. He sat down on the cold marble of his own great stair, in front of 400 guests, in front of the lords whose good opinion was the whole of his world, and he put his face in his hands. And he was not acting, because some ruins are too large to perform. He had cast out his wife for barrenness in front of the county. The county now stood in his hall and saw his living sons, born of that wife, hidden by his own mother, while he wed his mistress over their supposed grave. And the wife he had cast out owned the ground he sat upon. There was no part of him left standing. But Marianne was not finished with Sabine after all, because mercy is not the same thing as omission. And a truth left half told is a door left open for the liar to crawl back through. Sabine Carew, even now, with the boys in the room and the deed read out, was gathering herself for one last cast. Marianne could see her doing it, could see the quick, calculating flick of her eyes around the hall, looking for the seam in the crowd's sympathy, the lord who might yet take her part. The version of the night in which she was the wronged innocent of a vengeful first wife. So Marianne closed the door. "Before you decide where your pity lands tonight," she said, "to the hall and not to Sabine, you should know one thing more about the future Countess of Wildicombe, for I would not have any honest man here misled twice in one evening." She turned to Mr. Penhallow, who drew a second slimmer paper from his bundle, because Marianne had set him, in the long patient weeks, to learn not only her own truth, but her enemies'. "Miss Sabine Carew," said Penhallow, in the same flat-reading voice, "came to this county 4 years ago as the widow of a Bristol wine merchant. She is not a widow. The man she calls her late husband, Mr. Josiah Carew, is living, and keeps a chandler's shop in Bristol to this hour, and has sworn before a magistrate, Sir Tobias Vane, who holds the deposition, that his wife deserted him and his 3 children 4 years ago, took the contents of his strong-box, and has never been lawfully parted from him by any court in England. She is not free to marry. She never was. Had the Earl wed her, he would have wed a felon and a bigamist, and the marriage would have been void from the first hour. Which means, my lord," and here Penhallow allowed himself the one dry flick of pleasure in his whole performance, "that the heir you hoped this lady would give you would have been no heir at all." and your barren marriage to the Countess would have been dissolved to make room for a union that could give you nothing but disgrace and a halter. That was the second gasp, and it was deeper than the first, because the first had unmade the Earl, and this one unmade the woman he had chosen over the wife who owned his world. And it did it not by Marianne's invention, but by Sabine's own 4-year-old crime walking in the door behind her. And here was the cruel symmetry the whole county would speak of for a generation, that the Earl had cast out a true and faithful wife for being barren, to wed a false and felonious one whose every promise was a forgery, and that he had been, in the one estimate that decides a man's whole fortune, exactly as blind about the woman he wanted as about the woman he discarded. He had read both women precisely wrong, in the precisely opposite direction, and his ruin was simply the bill for a lifetime of seeing nothing. Sabine Carew understood it before he did. Sabine had spent 4 years reading the Earl's face for advantage. And she read it now and saw there was no advantage left in it, and her whole power had been the Earl's belief in her, and the Earl could no longer believe in anything, least of all himself, so Sabine Carew's gold-clad triumph collapsed all at once into the ordinary frightened face of a penniless runaway wife who has gambled 4 years on a man and lost. And she did not faint. And she did not weep, she simply turned, in the dead silence, the diamond at her throat catching the candlelight one last useless time, and walked out of the gallery alone, and not one of the 400 people who had applauded her down the stair an hour before put out a hand to stop her, and that, the walking out alone, unstopped, unmourned, with a felon's road waiting at the gate, was a more complete fall than any scene she might have made. Marianne let her go. She had no quarrel with Sabine beyond the truth, and the truth had already finished her. Now Marianne climbed the great stair, past her ruined husband sitting on the marble, and she turned at the half landing where every face in the hall could see her, and she said the last thing, the thing she had carried, sealed for 9 years, and would not show even Bess. "There was a second instrument in my grandfather's packet," she said. "He drew it the year I married, knowing the man he married me to better than I did. He could have left me only the deed, and let me ruin the Earl utterly, turn him and his name into the road, take the house, the lands, the title seat, leave him nothing. That is my legal right, and I will not exercise it." A murmur of astonishment. The Earl lifted his head. "My grandfather wrote that mercy was the only revenge that leaves the avenger clean. So, I will not take Ravensmore from the Wildercombe name. I will hold it in trust for my sons. They are the heirs of this house, by blood and by law both, and they will have it, and a guardian I name to raise them, and an income to keep them as gentlemen until they are of age. The Earl may keep his title, a title is only a word, and he has shown us all tonight what his word is worth. He may keep these rooms as a tenant, at a rent, under my son's trust, for as long as he lives quietly and never again raises his hand or his voice against a woman who cannot answer him. That is my judgment. It is gentler than he deserves and harder than he can bear. And that is exactly as I intend it." She came down the stair then, past the broken Earl, to the 2 frightened boys standing under the portraits of their fathers, and the great Countess of Wildercombe in her midnight blue and her grandfather's sapphires knelt down on the marble in front of 400 people and put her arms around her 2 stolen sons. And that was the only time in the whole long night that she wept, and no one in that hall, not the proudest lord of them, thought the less of her for it. They thought the more. And it was then, only then, with her name cleared and her sons in her arms and nothing left owed to anyone, that she lifted her eyes through the blur of her own tears and found, across all that bright, crowded ruin. The one face she had been not looking for the whole night, Sir Tobias Vane, plain and unfashionable at the back of the hall, who had set down his wine 6 weeks ago so his hand would not shake, and who was looking at her now the way a man looks at the one thing he has wanted and never let himself reach for, and who came forward through the parting crowd, slowly, not presuming, and stopped a respectful distance away and bowed to her first, before the Earl, before the lords, before any of them, and said only, in his plain, truthful magistrate's voice, "My lady, I have admired you for 3 years, and feared to say so while you were unfree. You are free now, and I find I am no braver than I was, so I will only say this, when you have raised your sons, and want for nothing, and need no man, if on some ordinary evening you should wish for company that asks nothing of you but the pleasure of your conversation, I am at Vane Court, and I will keep a chair by the fire, and I will wait as long as you like." And Marianne Ravensmore, who had not been truly seen by a man in 9 years, looked at the one who had seen her before he knew her name, and the cold, beautiful control she had, held like armour through 6 weeks of war, softened, just at the corners of her mouth, into something that was not yet a smile, but was the ground a smile would grow from, and she said, "Sir Tobias, I have spent 9 years among people who wanted everything from me, and saw nothing. A man who asks nothing and sees everything need not wait at all. You may give me your arm out of this hall if you will, and walk me and my sons to the gatehouse, and we will speak of fires and chairs another evening, when I am less inclined to weep, and more inclined to mean it." He gave her his arm. The boys took her other hand, one on each, the shepherd Croft following, and Bess behind with her chin high and her eyes wet and furious glad, and the magistrate and the countess and the 2 recovered heirs of Ravensmore walked the length of the gallery and out through the great doors into the autumn night, under the blazing windows of the house that was theirs. And behind them the Earl of Wildacombe sat alone on the cold stair of his borrowed home, in the ruin of a celebration he had bought to humiliate a woman he had been too proud to see, and the 400 guests filed out around him in a silence worse than any judgment, because they had come to watch a wife discarded, and they had stayed to watch a man unmade by his own mouth. And there is no recovering a name from a thing the whole county saw. Marianne did not look back. She had inverted the table. The woman who had walked out of the dining hall in silence 6 weeks ago, counted as nothing, now walked out of the gala with her sons, her fortune, her name, and the beginnings of a love she had earned on her own terms, while the man who had counted her as nothing sat where she had sat. In the silence she had taught him, learning at last what it costs to call a strong woman barren when she is holding, in the quiet of her folded hands, the deed to everything you own. She raised 2 future Earls of Wildacombe at Vane Court, in the end, in a plain house full of fires and chairs, and a man who told the truth. And the title meant nothing to her and everything to the world, and that was the joke of it that she savoured to the end of her long life, that she had become the most powerful woman in 3 counties by the simple expedient of being, all along, exactly who she had always been, and waiting for the proud to insist, in front of witnesses, that she was no one. The strong do not announce their strength. They fold their hands, and they wait, and they let the proud man dig. And when he tells the world you are nothing, you have only to open your grandfather's packet and walk in, and let the truth do what truth does when it is finally let into a bright and crowded room.